Give me a sec. Oh, there we go. All right, so we are live, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I'm with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, and we do have some folks joining us for the first time today, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And of course, there are no classrooms right now. All of you guys are stuck at home, so we've so appreciated you tuning in on YouTube and live here on Zoom with us, whether at home with your family, with classes tuning in on YouTube, however it may have been, as we continue to highlight some really cool scientists, explorers, and organizations from across the globe. Today, we continue our fantastic series with Environment and Climate Change Canada. We've done, I think, 20, 30 programs with them over the last few years. We've got a whole bunch this week for you guys as we're celebrating environment, oceans, and so much more. And so we are joined by Phil Thomas. So he is a wildlife toxicologist working in the Science and Technology branch of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And his talk is going to touch upon so many things that we have never covered here in the history of this program, which I'm really excited about. So he's going to talk about hunter-trapper harvested wildlife monitoring component. He's going to talk about, I believe, the oil sands and conservation there, which is really exciting, something we've never covered. And most importantly, his talk centers on environmental contaminant monitoring through an Indigenous community-based program, which is really exciting to us. For those of you who joined us last October, we worked with the Gord Downey Cheney Wenjack Fund and over 25 programs highlighting Indigenous scientists, researchers, and explorers from around the globe. So we're always excited to highlight that element of our story, especially here in Canada. And so without further ado, thank you so much, Phil, for joining us, and let's dive in and take us away.
Hey, thank you so much, Jesse, and really super happy to be here, you guys. It's a great honor for me. So let me just switch over to share my screen. There you go. Bear with me for a second. And then I'll go to slideshow and get her started. Okay, so Jesse, you can see this okay and everybody's fine?
Perfect. Looks great, man. Let's do it.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so I am really happy to be here today. I'm here to speak to you on monitoring environmental contaminants through Indigenous community-based monitoring programs. So as Jesse said, I'm Phil Thomas. I'm a wildlife toxicologist. A toxicologist is a scientist that basically studies the impacts or the effects of pollution or other contaminants on the health of, in my case, wildlife, but you've got other scientists that study the impacts of contaminants and toxic substances on humans as well. So I work on wildlife for Environment and Climate Change Canada. And this is just basically a little chart here to show you, you know, where I'm situated in the whole government architecture. So Environment and Climate Change Canada is a department of the government of Canada. I'm part of the Science and Technology branch, and especially the Wildlife and Landscape Science Directorate. So what we do a lot of applied research. We provide science advice and do science assessments. We have a special focus on species at risk and migratory birds because there's these transboundary issues. We do a lot of ecotoxicology and wildlife health research, as well as we monitor the levels of these pollutants, both in time and through space, so contaminant monitoring. So we do a lot of those. You spoke earlier to my colleague, Dr. Adam Smith, and Adam was saying that he's got the best job in the world, and I feel like he's wrong because I've got the best job in the world. Adam actually just works down the hall from me at the National Wildlife Research Center in Ottawa. He's part of the Canadian Wildlife Service, so it's part of those 7 other branches at Environment Climate Change Canada. And you've heard my dear colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Gallarneau's research project or program yesterday, and tomorrow is Dr. Greg Mitchell as well. And everybody's doing such excellent work. I encourage you to tune in. So my journey, so where I'm from, I'm originally from a small rural town in Eastern Ontario, just east of Ottawa, called Embrun. I was born and raised on a family-operated dairy farm. My dad was a mechanic, and it was a big family affair. So after I went through primary school and secondary school, then I went to the University of Ottawa, where I was on my way to becoming a doctor, I believed, and so did a lot of animal physiology, and I always had an interest in wildlife and just spending so much time outside with family camping and fishing. So it's something that I always loved. So I did a bachelor's of science degree in animal physiology. And then I had this other adventure and this other opportunity presented to me where I was able to move to Prince George, British Columbia at the University of Northern BC where I started a master's research project on looking at the impacts of of wind farms, so wind energy projects on migratory birds. So basically what the work involved is setting up these modified marine radars on top of ridge lines, and we had a number of sites, and we would basically count birds and measure their altitude, their bearing, and where they were on the landscape. And then we'd use this information to basically develop these models to help wind farm proponents, for example, strategically sit their turbines or to idle their turbines in times of higher migration activity, which was a really cool project. We're camping in a tent for 6 months a year, which is pretty hardcore. It's on top of ridge lines where they're putting wind turbines, so you can be guaranteed that it's always super windy and there's no covers. So it was definitely some of the most challenging field work I've ever done before. After my master's, I was lucky enough, I was able to find employment with Environment and Climate Change Canada in 2008. So I moved back to Ottawa, be closer to my family. And then in 2011, I was able to land this really sweet research program looking at the impacts of contaminants in fur bearers. So I went from migratory birds to fur bearers. My colleague Adam Smith, if you watch his presentation, he went from fur bearers to migratory birds, just kind of the opposite direction. But nonetheless, National Wildlife Research Center is the bottom left corner. And these are just some of the species that I work with. So muskrats, American marten, river otters, fisher and lynx, to name a few, migratory birds, and then the prey items of these animals. So otters eat a lot of fish. So then we look at the impacts of that pollution on the health of fish, and as a result, the health of otters that consume the fish. So a lot of this work, again, is done in collaboration with many stakeholders and hunters, trappers that are, from coast to coast to coast. My employer, Environment and Climate Change Canada, was kind and supportive enough to allow me to turn my research program at Environment Canada into a PhD. So I just in the process of wrapping up. I'm just waiting for my defense, actually, my PhD, and that was done back at the University of Ottawa, because I'm working in Ottawa. And basically what I did is I wanted to provide a deeper understanding on the impacts of hydrocarbons on the hormonal systems of free-ranging river otters. So what I did is I evaluated where some of that pollution came from, and then if that pollution was being picked up by animals, by lower trophic, so animals at the lower trophic levels or lower in the food chain, and then those predators of those lower trophic animals. And then I looked at whether or not these same contaminants could have an impact on the hormonal systems of otters, because hormones are really important in regulating a lot of our internal processes and making sure we're healthy and digesting our food properly and extracting all the vitamins we need or reproducing when we need to. So before we get too much into it, I'm speaking to you today from Chesterville, Ontario, just east of Ottawa, and I wanted to acknowledge the fact that my house is built on unceded Algonquin territory. I do a lot of work with Indigenous people, and if we can take a minute to reflect on those that came before us. So not only our elders and our immediate families, but before there were even Europeans that came to Canada. So the first Norse settlement was 10th or 11th century in Lasso Meadows in Newfoundland, and then there was the first European contacts in the 14th and 15th century with some Indigenous nations in Canada. And they were here before us, and they have witnessed many changes. And those changes have been passed down from generation to generation, communicated orally by these nations. On the right-hand side is the Indigenous medicine wheel. It basically represents the holistic worldview of Indigenous culture. It's this circular relationship where everything is connected, and the four cardinal points are air, fire, and water, earth, animals and humans, we're all connected. And I feel like this is a really important point, because oftentimes when we look at monitoring the environment, or we think of our relationship with the natural world around us, we've forgotten that we're also part of that environment. We're also part of that ecosystem. When we manage research programs or mitigation programs, or we try to fix a lot of the past mistakes we've done in the environment, there's always an economist somewhere weighing the cost benefits. How much will these actions cost us, and what benefit will we pull from the environment in return? And it's a fair assessment to make, but at the same time, I feel like we're always forgetting that we are part of the environment. And this is something that's been really drilled into me working with a lot of the Indigenous nations, is the fact that we are all part of the environment. How can we be so naive sometimes to think that we can be polluting water, and eventually that pollution doesn't make its way into our bodies when our bodies are 70% water, or what we release into the air, how that is not eventually picked up by us and incorporated into our bodies. So having that worldview where we are not interacting with the environment, but we're at one with the environment, and there's this whole circular relationship with the world around us, I think is really important. So I just wanted to start by acknowledging this and encouraging you to think of those that came before you. So I spoke that they've witnessed many changes, and for the most part, you know, if we think of big cities being built, that's a little bit, you know, a few hundred years ago. But for some of these really recent projects, oil sands, logging, or whatnot, you'll see dramatic changes in landscape. So for logging, for instance, you go from pristine boreal forest to cut blocks, which are pretty dramatic. The prairies and grassland, and you get agriculture. Boreal forests again, and you get tailings ponds and open pit mines for mining. So these changes have been observed by Indigenous communities that have these really close relationships with the land. They live off the land and they live on the land, and they're concerned. And again, that traditional knowledge, those changes that they've seen, and all that information that they have, you know, been collecting for you know, they've been here for thousands of years, is again really important, and really important to consider in some of the work that we do. So I do a lot of work in the oil sands. Why the oil sands? This project started in late 1950s, early 1960s. There is a lot of infrastructure. That's oil sands extraction is a water intensive process. So there's a lot of infrastructure on the Athabasca River or near the Athabasca River. So there are some concerns that some of those pollutants might be entering the environment. There's a lot of deposition, and Elizabeth talked about aerial deposition of some of these contaminants. And this is a natural wetland that I was on, and it's easy to see, if you can, in the background there, just over the horizon, those plumes that coming off of an upgrader. So we know that there has been increased inputs in some of these contaminants in the oil sands, especially the hydrocarbons. And those traditional knowledge holders, those people that are living off the land, those Indigenous nations, are really driven by two main questions. Is the food safe to eat? And is their water safe to drink, right? So we know that there are food security issues in many of our Indigenous communities in Canada. There's a lot of water quality issues as well. And for people that don't have the option of simply driving to the nearest store and buying the cheapest food, when your option is either buying a $20 liter of orange juice or drinking water from nature, or harvesting your own meat, berries, you're concerned about some of those changes that you've seen. You're concerned about pollution and whether or not the food in your refrigerator, i.e. your backyard, is still safe for you and your family. So Indigenous environmental monitoring is nothing new, as people that are really have this close relationship with the land. They're often on the land, and they've been noting changes for many centuries. And when we work with Indigenous nations, the first question is not so much how should we monitor the system, but what should we monitor and why? What is important to them? What changes have you seen? And why should we be monitoring these things together? And I feel like this is where we see a lot of intersection between some of our Western science, some of what the traditional scientists do, and those traditional knowledge holders, is in the selection of that what to monitor. Maybe it's this. Yeah, so perfect. Next slide is this biomonitoring. So the canary in the coal mine, and I'm sure, you know, we've all heard the canary. Canaries are really sensitive birds. They've got large lung capacity, large volume, unidirectional lung flow as well. So they're really sensitive to toxic gases. So coal miners in the early days, but up until the 1980s in Europe, in some places, they were still using canaries, bringing them into the coal mines. And when the canary would die, they would know that there'd be a toxic gas, so everybody would get out of the mine. And this is what we do with bioindicator species. A bioindicator species is an animal that tells us something about the health of the environment. So using bioindicator species has allowed us to study different types of environments using many different species, from the smallest diatoms to the largest muskrats and otters and everything in between. Certainly, again, depending on the system and the stressors, you want to choose those bioindicators wisely. But from a traditional knowledge perspective, and as I mentioned before, this intersection with Western science, it's easy for us to start considering animals that are not only good bioindicators, they don't only tell us something about the health of the environment, but they also mean something to the people that depend on river otters. So for those commercial fur traders, for those indigenous nations that count on, for example, the fur trade for sustenance or for meat, for example, you know, it's easy to pick indicator species that tell us something about the health of the environment, but that are also culturally and traditionally important to those nations. And I'll give you an example, and this is something that I study a lot in my research program, river otters. So this pictogram was appropriated from the Haida Nation on the West Coast. It's not the Boreal Nations I work with in Treaty 8 in Alberta, but regardless, semi-aquatic fur bears, animals that live or share a close relationship with the water, and you see this by the water going through the otter here. The indigenous communities realize that any animal that is tied to the water, that shares this close relationship with water, would tell us whether or not the water is safe. So when a fisher is out there and he sees a large number of dead fish on the water, he gets concerned about the health of the water. The water must be polluted, there must be lower oxygen or whatnot. Why are these fish dead? For an otter that lives in the water, that feeds on those fish, again, water is really important. It's a source of energy, it's a source of birth, it signifies birth and rebirth, and it's you know, it's a culturally important animal. And it's also, from a Western science perspective, a really good bioindicator, because mustelids, the family of otters, are sensitive to aquatic pollution. They're top predators of coastal or nearshore habitats. So it means that if there's pollutants that can accumulate to high levels that might impair health in their bodies, then you would detect those in top predators. They've got small home ranges, 20 to 40 linear kilometers. They've got a seasonally constant home range. They don't migrate, they don't hibernate. So that means that they're exposed to pollutants year round. And there's been some population declines across North America that have been attributed to pollution. So otters are both a good indicator species from a traditional knowledge perspective, from an indigenous knowledge perspective, and from a Western science perspective. So what we do is we identify some of that common ground, and then we start working together. We start identifying, you know, some of those changes that you've seen on the land. So a lot of the elders and traditional land users have talked to us about tumors and lesions on skin, about more parasites in the liver of muskrats, about certain fishers having more liquidy blood and having patchy fur. And there's all of these little signs and little descriptions that, you know, my grandfather used to go fish and set some nets at this area, and there used to be tons of fish, but now there's no more fish, and we see more of this animal. So all of these changes and all this information, this traditional knowledge, basically informs the design of the monitoring that we do in those systems. What's really super important as well is learning from one another. So it's not just the scientists going into a community and hiring an indigenous community member to be their boat driver for the day. It's about really integrating yourself inside the community. It's about spending time with everyone from youth to elders and understanding what concerns them. I've met a youth at a meeting with international scientists. The youth was anxious about changes in the water quality that he's seeing in the Delta, and he's worried about his future and if he'll be able to go out fishing with his kids. And he's 10 years old, and I know other 10-year-olds that all they worry about is their next Fortnite game or whatever. So again, like, it's, you know, this anxious feeling, this loss of connection with their natural environment is causing a lot of social anxiety in these communities. And again, this is something that, you know, we can try to work on together through offering these opportunities to basically to speaking to one another, to working with one another, and learning what matters most to you, and how we can better address these concerns through some of the work that we do. Learning from one another, often I spoke about integrating. So, you know, integrating, and there's an example here, like an elder with a Western scientist and a parks manager working on a muskrat, identifying, you know, so the elder changes in smells and colors that he's seen through the years, changes in fat deposition patterns, bringing everybody together in classrooms, Indigenous, non-Indigenous elders, community leaders, and matching them together at a table, and sharing the task of you know, doing a dissection or collecting water samples or sediment samples, and then at the same time, like, having the opportunity to really connect and share knowledge in an environment that's a little bit less sterile than sitting at a desk and doing a formal interview. So what I've done through the years, and this is in the oil sands mostly, is I've developed these tools, a toolbox where we can have these tools to help us answer questions on the health of the environment. And at the same time, we can engage those people that are on the land, that are living off the land, in collecting some of that data for us and in collaboration with us. So it involves a lot of training, obviously, and then the results are generated together and communicated back to the community. So here's an example of a non-invasive river otter latrine. So river otters are like cats. They'll always defecate in the same spots, latrine sites. So it's easy for us to go to these latrine sites, sample feces, swab the feces, you get DNA, you collect the feces, you can get fecal hormones, you can look at metabolism of contaminants. So we can start pulling good information from non-invasive samples like fecal samples, or even fur samples from some of these animals. A little bit more invasive, there's a commercial fur trade. So for some of these carcasses that are usually recycled back into nature, we can collect those carcasses and we can look at endpoints. So for example, some nations shared with us that they were concerned about a lack of certain fur bearers. We're seeing less otters, but there's more fish, so it's not a question of food, it might be a question of reproduction. So let's look at river otter reproduction. We can look at river otter baculum strength, and this is something we've done. The penile bone of a river otter, we've done densitometry, so looking at the amount of calcium and how dense and hard the bone was and how prone to fracture it was. And we can look at reproductive endpoints in the females, looking at the number of fetuses and how contaminants can be transferred from mom to fetus as well. And that's really good information if the mom is being exposed to certain contaminants that are being transferred into their fetuses, and there might be outcomes, pregnancy outcomes that are less desirable. So these are all endpoints that we can look at. And I'm doing this with colleagues at McMaster University. So it's really great relationship. We see, your dogs and cats are vaccinated against diseases like canine distemper virus and rabies. Well, we see the same diseases out in nature in some of these animals, and we know that some of that pollution, some of those contaminants are causing or reducing our immune system response to some of these stressors. So if you're being exposed to a certain type of pollutant and your immune system goes down, you're a little bit weaker, then you might get a disease more. And this is some work that we've done with colleagues at the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, where we've looked at the presence and absence of these diseases as a function of the contaminants that we were detecting in those carcasses. So all of these tools kind of culminated eventually in a collaborative initiative. It was a Environment Climate Change Canada received funding through our strategic partnership initiative that was administered by Indigenous and Northern Affairs. And we, together with the communities, with employers, we came out with a training program that is rooted in traditional knowledge. So it's a training to employment program that students, Indigenous students, can take. All you need is grade 10 math. And basically what we do is we develop and deliver this training that is again rooted in Indigenous knowledge and Western science. There's some co-teaching. It meets the interests of the communities and the employees. It fills those gaps that the local companies have in hiring local talent. It supports access to some of these local environmental monitoring jobs in the communities. And it facilitates these Indigenous-led environmental monitoring ventures, business ventures as well. So again, those tools that we've developed through these relationships with some of these Indigenous communities were rolled into a really great training program that was accredited and delivered by an academic institution in Alberta. Not to say that everything was perfect, there's nothing that's ever perfect, but it was at least a positive first step in delivering training and increasing capacity in these communities for them to participate in environmental monitoring. So the initiative advanced, a lot of our collective priorities. It supported the interests of many Indigenous communities. It advanced their efforts at monitoring the natural environment, and it advances, most importantly, truth and reconciliation. That is really important to our government. I'll give you two more little quick examples before wrapping this up today. And these are from two of my dear colleagues at Environment Climate Change Canada, the Cangoot Project, Dr. Dominique Henry. This I find is an amazing picture. These are snow geese, and you've all seen snow, those white geese in the springtime that land in a lot of the local fields, farmers' fields. And they're nesting in the Arctic in such high densities. And you see, they've basically shown, to show you the impact of these increases in snow geese population, they've fenced a little part of the Arctic tundra, a sensitive ecosystem, and you can see around the fence there that pretty much everything's dead, but inside the fence you've got this lush vegetation. So managing snow goose is really important. Cangoot means snow goose in Inuit language. So again, this project was initiated, and Dominique Henry was the lead here. It involved Inuit communities, and the same type of model. You train the Indigenous communities, you hire them, you hire community researchers. There's data sharing agreements and interviews where you're collecting a lot of that traditional knowledge. Where are you seeing the snow geese? How many snow geese? When is the timing of snow goose migration? You share results, and then you come out with with management strategies that work from both a Western science perspective and also from an Indigenous, or in this case, Arctic or Inuit research or Inuit perspective, where snow goose are still really important. The eggs are consumed, the animals are consumed. So we need monitoring programs or programs that manage snow goose populations in a way that benefit both Inuit communities and also us here down south. And the last example, another colleague of mine, Dr. Matt Beckner at the National Wildlife Research Center, the National Boreal Caribou Knowledge Consortium, basically, again, a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous Western scientists getting together, sharing knowledge, identifying knowledge gaps, and providing information to policy and decision makers on what we could do next, what would be our next step. So this idea of co-managing our resources, I think, is more developed up in some of those Arctic regions or those northern regions, and certainly something that is increasingly being debated and discussed at lower latitudes, like in sensitive areas like the Peace Athabasca Delta UNESCO World Heritage Site. Again, there's always a big push to co-manage with those communities, with those Indigenous communities that share such a close relationship with their land. They want to be involved in the process, and they want solutions to their problems as well, and they want results that address some of their concerns. So on this, I think I'll say a huge thank you to everyone for listening, and all the Indigenous nations and our provincial and territorial partners and academia, NGOs, and every student that works on these projects relentlessly. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. What a fantastic presentation, man. So you can leave that thank you slide up for a minute if you'd like, and then if you want to come out of that, we can see you and have a bit of a conversation. We've got people tuning in on YouTube from across Ontario, BC, New Jersey, New York, and more. So a huge thank you to all you for tuning in, and plus our live teachers. So we're going to do Q&A now. So between our live groups, I'm going to come to you each individually. People on YouTube, let me know where you're joining from. Share your questions. We'll take as many as we can over the next 10 minutes or so. So Phil, before we got underway, I just wanted to say, I think I like the competition with Adam Smith for best job in the world. You were certainly enthusiastic enough to highlight that you might have the take the cake. Is there a favorite part of your job? I mean, you get to do so much in so many places and highlight all this great work. Is there something that really jumps out that really, sparks you?
Well, I mean, like again, like I grew up hunting and fishing and being out there on the land and just having this, I think, agricultural background and my parents instilling in us the importance of, having, healthy lives and living in healthy environments. I think this opportunity for me to get paid, to work outside, to work with Indigenous communities, they take me to their best fishing spots, and here's where we got the biggest moose, and you get so excited you're with them, and it's just getting to learn from them and working with the youth, and I feel like sparking, sometimes, making them interested, making them realize that, hey, you can be a scientist and not wear a lab coat or not do statistics all the time like Adam. and you can be outside. You can do what you love to do, and you can connect with nature, and you can connect with some of the most passionate people that I've ever met. Just working together.
So your favorite part of your job is just all of it, is the moral of the story there.
Oh, I mean, yeah. my least favorite part is doing the dishes in the lab, personally.
That's funny. Adam's coming on again next week. I think you should join him. You guys should just have like a throwdown. It could be our first in history of the program. But with that, Phil, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Gualtieri, joining us in Niagara Falls. If you have a question for us, Ms. Gualtieri, from your students, you're demuted. Go for it.
I have no students questions coming in right now from the students. It's very thorough, your presentation. I loved it. I just wonder, what is the major, where's the question I had here? What is the biggest environmental contaminant you would say that you're worried about at this time? Like,
yeah.
The government of Canada works on a list of priority pollutants. A lot of these pollutants are continuously being assessed through programs like our chemicals management program. There are so many of them. I don't think the question is what is the most important pollutant, because we've heard of examples like mercury, PCBs, DDT that are really toxic. In my opinion, is what makes a chemical important. So it's how persistent it is in the environment. So any pollutant that is really persistent, that doesn't break down, that gets picked up by animals, that accumulated at high enough levels where you can start seeing damage and impaired health, is an important pollutant. And there's many pollutants that are persistent, that are bioaccumulative, and also share some inherently toxic properties. And again, like, I don't think it's the one. I think there are many pollutants that are bad pollutants that are really important to monitor. So it's kind of like moving away from having just the one, but considering those characteristics that make them important.
Yeah. This ecosystem approach is something that we hear in a lot of conservation stories, whether it's pollutants or individual species or how we work in conserving an ecosystem. So I'm glad we got that message, and thanks, Phil. All right, I'm going to go to Ms. Boss's class, joining us in St. Mary's, Ontario. If you have a question for us, you're good to go.
Yeah, okay, we are in and I just want.
Oh, Francis, I think you got some reverb with Google Meet. So,
no, the meet is off, actually. I'm not on there.
No, Denise, there's two of you at the same time. You're both in St. Mary's.
Oh, I'm in Emeryville.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry. Francis, I'll come back to you in just 2 seconds, okay? Because it was quite a bit of reverb. So Denise, if you have a question for us, go for it.
We have three, actually, and we want to say congrats to Philippe. I know I worked with University of Windsor before I started this job in earth sciences. I certainly miss being in the outdoor labs. But the first question is, do you feel that if we had followed the Indigenous people's teachings early on, rather than suppress them, that we would be better off today as far as the environment and our overall culture is concerned? That's the first one.
Like it.
Well, I mean, short answer is yes. I mean, any teaching that teaches you, or any knowledge system that teaches you respect for the environment and stresses the importance of that connection that we share with the environment, I think is fundamentally super important for us to make good management decisions. So I'd say yes. I think we'd be better off to have like a more holistic circular worldview, as opposed to here are humans and this is the environment and how do we interact with one another.
Fantastic. Denise, if you want to do a second one right now, go for it. We'll save the third. We'll come back to you in another round, okay?
Our second one is when a bioindicator becomes extinct, if that species becomes extinct, do all of the other connected species become at risk very quickly, or is it a longer chain reaction result?
Yeah, question.
Yeah, so you've got, so I think we're mixing two concepts here. So there are keystone species, so species that are really important for proper ecosystem integrity. So if that species disappears, there's a cascading effect on all the other species that depend on it. Bioindicator species, when you select a bioindicator species, you try not to select those really rare ones that are super sensitive to every stressor that might go extinct, or not extinct, but at least disappear from your study area. So you want to select something that's kind of in between being really common and resistant to those stressors, but it's also not too rare or at risk of disappearing or moving out of your study area. So it's a delicate balance. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. All right, Francis, come on back up and just should be good to go, hopefully.
Can you hear me?
Kind of. I'm close to the camera.
I listened to you speak about the relationship between the Indigenous group that you're studying and then the scientists that are studying and the government paying for a lot of the studies. What is the partnership between the companies and the and what we find partners, people that
So, Francis, we sort of catch like independent words in there, but not the whole thing. So if you could type that in the chat bar to me, I'll pass along the whole question, okay? Sorry for the trouble. I don't know why the audio decided to, have a big problem. Phil, I will pass along a question from YouTube though. So Jenna wants to know, she's super keen, she loved the presentation. She wants to know if environmental contaminants affect the feeding behaviors of animals in these areas.
Yeah, so certainly there are some examples of some contaminants that have an impact on the metabolism and the energy of the animals. So for example, I'll give you one that I've worked on in fur bearers, rodenticides, so rat poisons. And you'd be surprised as to how the incidence of non-target poisonings to rat poison there is in the environment. Even in really remote areas of the boreal forest, you can still detect rat poisons in some fur bearers and predatory birds and owls and those guys. So being exposed to rat poisons makes you really lethargic. So it does have an impact on your feeding ecology, most definitely.
Okay.
So it's all about energy and how much energy you've got to pursue prey or to find food.
Right. This is a great follow-up. We're waiting for Francis to type in her question. That same sort of a follow-up on that exact, the last question. Once pollutants are detected in river otters or other species that you work with, how do you ensure the safety of the community? I mean, once you decide that there's, heavy pollutants in some of these animals, what do you do if that's the food source, if that's the, area where people live?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So Environment Canada doesn't have the mandate or other capacity to address human health issues. We're not medical doctors. So what we do is we have close relationships and good collaborative relationships with a lot of the local health authorities, be they provincial or territorial health authorities that have the staff and the medical expertise on hand. So we share data with them. They evaluate things like how much is consumed, who consumes it. Is it, pregnant moms, or is it elders or young adults? And then how much is consumed as well. And then they roll this data into a risk assessment. And if need be, then they'll issue consumption advisories. And you see those for fish most often. If you're out fishing on some lake, sometimes they tell you can't eat more than 1 or 2 fish of this weight at this lake. So that's because there's most likely mercury in that fish, and they want to make sure that you're not eating too much mercury. So there are some medical doctors out there that we work with, that we collaborate with, that generate that kind of information for us.
Fantastic. So nice to hear about cross-governmental collaborations. Phil, we're going to take a few more questions before we wrap up. Okay, so Frances just sent in hers. I'll come to Ms. Gualterius in a second. You spoke about the partnerships between communities and the studies. Also on the government is a partnership based on funding and truth and reconciliation. The question is about the companies that are mining, developing, and harvesting resources in the areas you studied. Are they working in these partnerships as well? So is resource extraction companies, communities involved in this decision-making process?
Yeah, I think, depending on the community, there's a lot of politics at play. Obviously, some companies, and I'm not just talking about oil sands, I'm talking about logging or, pesticides manufacturers, whoever. Some companies are better at fostering constructive and positive relationships with stakeholders and their neighbors than other companies. So in a lot of the cases, companies are often engaged in the process. There's often an active sharing of data and meetings and follow-ups, and we have good communication with the companies, and their level of integration or how much they get involved in some of this work is, it depends. Like, for the oil sands monitoring program, it's arm's length, so the companies don't want to be seen as interfering with the science, for example. So funds comes through this other organization of different companies together, and in other cases, like I've been working on, for example, a pesticide study with like this really great forestry company, and they're involved and they're keen and they're on the ground, they're collecting samples for us, and they're communicating that data back to their stakeholders, and so it depends on I guess the breadth of the program and the politics at play, but I think there's always positive will on behalf of those companies to try to work with their stakeholders.
Fantastic. That's a really nice message, and sort of, I think, an unexpected one for some of the groups that might be tuning in, but it's fantastic. Phil, we are unfortunately getting near the end of the presentation. Again, I told you it'd be the fastest 40 minutes of your life. So a quick query for you before I'm going to take one more question actually from YouTube to share, because I think it's a great one to end with. Are you okay if I take some more questions from the teachers that are joining us after the fact and send them to you? Could you answer it that way?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I figured you'd say yes to that. You're a pretty agreeable guy. Okay, so we'll do that after the fact for our live groups. That's fantastic. The question coming in from Danny Kingsbury, joining us in Quebec, is what would you say to a student or a youth who wanted to pursue a career in STEM fields like you ended up doing?
Hey, I would say go for it. Again, like, when I started university, I had my eyes, opened as to all the possibilities, all of the different jobs out there. Like, again, if you're a scientist or if you're considering a career in STEM, you're not just going to be wearing a lab coat and stuck in a lab all day and all night long. There's so many different kinds of jobs that you can do with a degree in science or engineering or math. So I would strongly suggest you to, start small, just, keep all the doors open and go to school and try to follow your heart and what really drives you.
Yeah. Beautiful message. And when we get from a lot of our conservation scientists that join us, it's really nice to highlight that, there's so many opportunities for people with passion now. In fact, I was going to highlight Environment Climate Change Canada's website actually has some really great resources for youth. So if you're keen, you can check that out. You can email us and we can link that to you in any comment later on after the fact. And as Phil started this presentation with, we are always doing presentations with some really cool Environment and Climate Change Canada scientists. So Adam Smith, Elizabeth Gatineau, Greg Morris tomorrow. So a whole bunch of great people, whatever topic you're keen on, we are excited to share that sort of work with you and hopefully get you inspired. I'm certainly inspired by your talk today, Phil. This was fantastic. And we really, really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thanks.
To all our teachers, thanks so much. Please do send me those questions. We'll get to them to Phil as soon as we can. And for now, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you all soon. Bye, guys.